They're calling like, okay, please God, just tell me he's not there. Tell me right now. And that's what the call is to them. They have pretty much usually no idea that we basically have a whole system here and that they're entering a whole other process. Um, and that I can't tell them that. Like, all I can say is, I'll either, mostly I say I'll call you back after I've done a search, and then usually what I'm telling them at that point is, well, right now I don't think that he's here, but I can't be certain because of all the other analyses that have to happen on the unidentified that we do have at that point. Or I'll say something like, I don't see any obvious possibilities, but there are about 15 people that I can't rule out. So I take a lot of information from the physical characteristics of the person, and I take their contact information and they go on a list and they get entered into NEMIS now. And then every once in a while we find a possible match, and those conversations are the hardest. I would say they're even harder than calling up, and I rarely get to call up and say, your missing person is here and he's dead and I'm really sorry to inform you. First of all, a phone call to do something like that is horrible. It should be done in person. I mean, there's so many unideal things that we have to do, but it's kind of like either you do it in an imperfect way or it doesn't get done. And we believe that it's important for it to get done, but it just makes me crazy because it's such a horrible issue for someone to have to hear that kind of news over the phone. But that type of informing phone call is very, very rare. Usually what I'm doing is there's someone that I'm looking at that could be your son, and do you have time to talk about some specifics? And so then I'll start to ask them specific questions about that person. Did he have this, or can you tell me more about that tattoo, or do you know when that tooth was pulled? Usually I'm trying to get more dental records, or basically to refer them back to the consulate or back to somewhere that can take their family reference sample for a DNA comparison, and then that takes months for them to get the results, and it's awful. The families are like in agony during that time. They don't know if the person is here or not, and it kind of tosses everything into chaos. They don't know if they should arrange a funeral. They're calling. Sometimes I'll come in the morning and I'll have like 20 voicemails from the same family overnight, that they're just like panicked and they're just calling constantly, which really stresses me out because I can't spend my whole day dealing with that one family. Although they're incredibly important to me, it really, they are having a crisis and I'm not, and that's hard. You can't go into crisis mode with them. Like, you have to have boundaries and try to do your job and move on to the next case. But
is there, I was wondering, because I know in some cold case type situations, either hearing that the family members there or not there, both of them are bad answers, because if they're there, then they're gone, but if they're not there, then where are they?
Yeah.
And they can't start to move on. And do you find that it's sort of, there's not really an answer that you can ever give them and that's really relief, because both ways it's, what do I do?
It's kind of, yeah, you're right. And it's interesting. I think sometimes for the families that have been waiting for a really long time, it actually is relief when they find out that he died definitively, and that they're able to finally bury him and finally let his kids know what happened to him. It's really, really hard to socially accept that someone is dead without knowledge that they're dead, without the body. And so there's all sorts of things that happen in a family. This is another piece of my research, all sorts of things that happen within a family when someone is missing, that are really, really, really challenging and difficult for the family members. So I think the longer that in general, it feels like sometimes when they've gone through that for a really long time, it is kind of a relief to know. And then with the people that are calling, and we get a lot of disputed IDs as well, which is really interesting. So we'll have a match with DNA or with dental records or whatever in the family. Will refuse the identification, or they'll refuse to talk to us. They don't want to have anything to do with us anymore. So I'm looking into different reasons for why that might be at different
Well, it might have something to do with what Austin is pointing out.
Mm-hmm. Sure, like denial.
Yeah.
There's,
Yeah,
I
and
think,
just
yeah, I think sometimes it's denial. I think there's, yeah, it really depends. There's a lot of complex things going on. Without a faith, um, it's a very, very difficult thing to tell someone this is your kid.
yeah.
That's bones. You know, and I'm constantly telling families, you know, when we do identify somebody, you know, I tell them I wouldn't look in the body bag if I were you. I would tell you not to do that. If it were my brother or my father or whatever, I wouldn't want to see him that way. And so I'm trying to, but you can't tell them not to, really. I mean, you can't
Right.
prevent them from, it's their person. So they, you know, do they need to know? Do they need to see it all? What do they need to see? Is it their right? Yes, I think it's their right, but it can backfire, because then they can say, no, it's definitely not him. I know it's not him. Doesn't, you know, this isn't, and then the ID is, and I don't know if that's a good thing for the family or not.
And if you have a positive ID but they refuse to accept it, does it still go to the county?
It does. It goes to the county and it's
Issue.
buried under that person's name.
Okay.
Because for us, scientifically, it's an ID. So rather than the rest of the unknowns that are buried with a number, with an ML number, a medical legal number for our office, that person would be buried or cremated with their name.
Okay.
That's a pretty intense situation
Yeah.
when the person is scientifically identified
Yeah.
and the family does not recognize
Yeah,
it.
I'm really, really interested in those
That's a very
situations.
that's a pretty powerful moment there.
You know, and there's just another thing that I think is possibly sometimes going on. There's a story that connects to this in Argentina after the Dirty War in Argentina, which was how the Argentine forensic team came to be. A famous forensic anthropologist who has worked with our forensic anthropologist, Clyde Snow, went down to Argentina after the war to try to identify some of the victims of the violence there, the state-backed violence, where people were disappeared. So that's kind of where Americans learned the term Los Desaparecidos, was from that context. There were mothers of the missing who, when the forensic scientists showed up and started to dig up these clandestine, unmarked graves, they were called Los Madres del Plaza del Mayo, and they actually protested what the forensic anthropologists were doing, and they would hurl rocks at them when Mercedes, some of the people that we're working with now, when they would show up at the grave sites, these mothers would throw rocks at them and prevent them getting access to the grave. And for them, it was basically they refused to give anything to the state, even the satisfaction of saying, okay, well, we've identified your person, so
Right.
you should be quiet now. You've gotten what you want, like, go to be at peace now. The mothers wouldn't even let them get close to saying, you know, you're done, because they still refused that the violence was not, that there was impunity, that those that did the violence were not in jail, that they were not paying a price for what they did. So there was a political reason for rejecting identifications in that case, and so I think sometimes that might be happening here too.